I greet you from Berlin. I'm standing here in our energy studio in our offices in the center of Berlin, close to the Reichstag. We are in the core of the political decision making, and we need to take these ideas that we're currently discussing with our partners in the German government, now also to Brussels. That's one of the missions that I am trying to pursue as president of the Natural Gas Vehicle Association in Brussels. I want to take you through the overview on what should be on the agenda of the gas industry in Europe when it comes to promoting natural gas as a fuel in transport. First slide, please. It shows us the Blue Corridors event. So I welcome you to this year's edition of the Blue Corridor event. Zukunft Gas is supporting Uniper and Gazprom in generating visibility for natural gas vehicles through this very unique endeavor to take gas vehicles, trucks and passenger vehicles throughout Europe. We already have been in a couple of different countries in this virtual format. We of course love to do it in the real deal, but this year everything is different. We are doing it as a virtual format, and I'm very happy to be, at least virtually today, in Paris. The big challenge that road transport in general is facing, and this will be the strongest and most important vector for future developments in this area, is of course the reduction of CO₂ emissions. The Commission's President Ursula von der Leyen has announced the bold target of a climate-neutral continent. It is, in her words, Europe's man on the moon mission to reduce CO₂ emissions of this continent to almost zero. But if you look at the current situation, if you look at what has been achieved so far, you have to acknowledge that the transport sector has not contributed anything so far to the CO₂ reduction. If you look at the numbers ranging back, you see it on this slide, 2005, but if you take it back to 1990, you have to acknowledge that no CO₂ emissions have been achieved in this so important sector. And we need to put this sector much stronger in focus. If you look into the transport sector in greater detail, you see that road transport is, of course, the biggest emitter of CO₂. We have other modes of transport, of course. We have maritime and aviation that needs to be decarbonized as well. We have discussions on this, but the focus of discussion, of course, needs to be on passenger vehicles, on light-duty trucks, and of course, heavy-duty trucks. So we need to look at the whole range of transport modes. If you look at what the European Commission has done in the recent years, you can see that many approaches to regulation have been taken. A lot of activities were unfolded in Brussels to tackle the issue of CO₂ emissions in transport, such like regulation on fuels, regulation on CO₂ fleet averages. The number of regulation has been growing over the last years. We have a very complex area of regulation in place, and you follow the news. The political debate, of course, is always about tightening the CO₂ targets, something that happened 2 years ago, and we're expecting this year as well. But at the end of the day, you have to see that no CO₂ emissions have been reduced despite these massive efforts of regulation and despite, of course, ever tightening targets. So what is actually the issue in this sector? So if you look at the overall final energy consumption, you see that electricity accounts only for 20% of Europe's energy consumption. And only half of the electricity is renewable these days. So we need solutions for the other 80% of our final energy consumption. If we don't decarbonize the molecules, we won't find solutions for a carbon neutral future. And putting all bets alone on electricity is not enough. We need other approaches, we need other solutions. And of course, natural gas vehicles with biomethane, but also hydrogen vehicles are certainly part of the equation, but are currently ruled out. Because we have this very unique situation that vehicles in Europe are only measured by their tailpipe emissions, and the other emissions that occur when electricity, for instance, is produced are not accounted in the current regulation, which is so important for the automotive manufacturers. You see this little cartoon here. Of course, this is a little bit exaggerating the situation. However, this is the current situation that we're facing in the regulation. And this leads to the situation that the OEMs are pushing so strongly forward the electrical vehicles because they do not have any other solution to solve this equation, despite the fact that the environment is not really positively affected. To dig deeper into details, let's have a look at the next slide. The current CO₂ regulation in Brussels, and this is affecting all the European manufacturers and importers, is based on the idea of a fleet average. So every car that is being sold in Europe is being accounted on a virtual balance, and taking the average on all vehicles that are being sold leads us to the figure that is the target that has been debated in the political arena. And if you look at how this average is being calculated, you see that electrical vehicles, but also hydrogen vehicles, are accounted for with 0 gram CO₂ emission, because electrical vehicles don't have a tailpipe. This is equalizing or balancing CO₂ incentive vehicles on the other end of the scale, like big SUVs and such like. But there are a couple of peculiarities to this system. One thing are plug-in hybrids. You see a very large vehicle running on a plug-in hybrid system, which is accounted for with only 56 grams. This is the result of a regulation that puts an electrical vehicle, a plug-in hybrid vehicle with a full battery on the test bed, and then it's running on 0 gram per kilometer until this battery is empty. And this results to situations that a large sports car, a large sports utility vehicle, despite a massive requirement of energy, has a very low carbon footprint in this equation. And coming to our area of expertise, the biomethane vehicles. Yes, they have a tailpipe. Yes, there is a CO₂ emission coming out of this tailpipe. But we all know that these CO₂ emissions are already accounted for because it's coming from the natural environment. The plants have taken out the CO₂ of the atmosphere. So it's a circular system with no carbon impact. But these cars have a tailpipe, and these cars are unfortunately accounted for in this scale with a fairly high CO₂ emission. And this situation leads to the effects that we're currently perceiving in the public debate, in the marketing of the OEMs. The car manufacturers do not have any interest to promote these kind of vehicles because it doesn't have any incentives. On the other side, the incentives for promoting electrical vehicles, despite all these negative aspects for the customers, they are more expensive, they have little range. Despite these negative aspects, the promotion of these vehicles is very strong. And this is resulted and rooted in this regulation. We have a good solution in place, actually. I already mentioned it. Take biomethane. We have the ability to provide climate neutral mobility using biomethane from manure, from waste. We have a solution to power passenger vehicles that are as comfortable as those with petrol and diesel, have long ranges, and the most important aspect, have very low cost. It's here in Germany, the cheapest way to drive a car, to run a car on biomethane. We have the abilities to use a lot of waste, a lot of manure to produce biomethane. This potential is not tapped into completely at all. We have a lot of potential to grow in this area. And we can, of course, expand this to the area of light and heavy duty trucks. We can take this green fuel to light duty trucks for all these logistic companies that are getting more and more important, particularly in these days when everyone is relying on Amazon, on other logistics companies to bring goods to home. And of course, we can provide green fuel also to heavy-duty trucks, by liquefying biomethane, by selling bio-LNG in a growing number of filling stations. Here in Germany, we have now a couple of dozens of LNG stations. We see a very strong growth for this area of transport because the logistic operators tell us this is the only sensible solution and sensible alternative to diesel to come to terms with the CO₂ targets. So in order to wrap it up, we need to create a political thrust to tackle the upcoming review of the CO₂ emission standards for new cars and vehicles. As part of the Green Deal that has been announced by the European Commission, the Commission wants to review the current system of regulation. And we're now at a pathway where we need to decide whether we simply want to tighten the screws, simply do some kind of evolutionary changes in the regulatory system with the risk that nothing changes, such like happened in the last decades, or if we change the regulatory system to a new approach which is effectively tackling CO₂. Because right now, the transport sector has not delivered anything and contributed anything to the CO₂ reduction. The key reason for that in our analysis is that the current regulatory system is flawed. We have two different silos that are being regulated. We have fuels, we have passenger vehicles, but these two silos are not connected with each other. The regulatory system is not effectively working due to this cause. And we need some kind of change, and we need a fundamental change of the regulatory system to tackle these issues. And the fundamental change is, of course, we need to move towards a well-to-wheel approach. The chances are high that we can bring this to the table, to the Commission, to the European Parliament, because these connections are now more and more understood. The willingness to move things in this area is rising. That's something that we clearly perceive. And furthermore, I think it's very important that the industry, the gas industry, is creating a concrete promise, is delivering concrete solutions, and not just talking about something that happens in the future. So we need to fight for the integration of biomethane into the system and, of course, a change of the system towards well-to-wheel. Thank you very much.